Hello everyone, in this video we are going to cover promises in JavaScript. And so I'm going to start out with a very simple starter project, and I'm going to copy and paste it. This is basically literally just a basic HTML or plain HTML page with an import of a script that has a hello world in it. So I'm going to rename this promises intro success, and we're going to make a couple different projects to demonstrate a variety of different things. So again, let's go ahead and look at this. This is just an index.html file with a script that imports the script.js and then a style.css that's not even really being used. So once we have this hello world, we can just, I'm going to move it into the promises folder here. And then I'm going to drag and drop this index.html file into the web browser. So drag, drop, enter, and then right click and inspect, and we see hello world. Okay, so we are ready to play around with our promises. A promise is used when we need to do something with data that will exist in the future. An example would be get 5 cats from cats.com and display the images. We don't want to wait for the images to be returned because the network could be slow, or maybe the images don't ever return at all. Asynchronous code allows us to do something that might take a while, like get pictures from another website, and run the rest of the program while the pictures are being fetched in the background. So let's create a promise and take a look at how it works. The first thing we're going to do is create the simplest promise that we can have. So I'm going to store this promise inside of a const called cats data, because we're eventually going to make it about cats. So I'm going to say const cats data equals new promise. And then we're going to pass in a callback function into the promise. And it's going to take one parameter for now, which is what happens when the function or when the promise succeeds. So we're going to call it resolve. And so inside of the body of this function is basically the promise. We're gonna fetch data, or we're gonna do a thing. And so for right now, we're just going to resolve the promise. We're just going to say yes, the promise succeeded. So I'm going to say, and then so we're going to pass in the success message or the success data into resolve, because we pass it into resolve when it succeeds. So I'm going to say the promise has succeeded. So we're passing it into resolve. And that is it for our promise for now. And then the next thing we need to figure out is, what does this resolve function do? So this is on the success of the promise. So this is itself is a function. So we need to run this function when the data succeeds with the success data. So I'm going to create a success callback function. I'm going to call it function success CB for callback. And then here's the data that we passed in. So this gets passed in via this res object, or this res parameter. So what do we do with the success? Well, I'm just going to console.log it. So I'm going to say console.log in success callback. And then we're going to pass the success message. So now, when this promise completes, we can do the success callback. So I'm going to say cats data dot then success callback. So basically, and then at the very end, I'm going to say console.log goodbye world. Okay, so I'm going to save this, and then I'm going to refresh. And let's look at the order. We get hello world, then goodbye world, then in success CB, the promise has succeeded. So if we look here, we get console.log hello world. That makes sense. This function gets created, but it's not used. the promise runs, and then it immediately resolves, but because it's in a promise, it gets stuck at the end of the event loop. So we continue running the program, and then at the very end, when there's nothing left to do, that's when the event loop checks to see if there's any new tasks. So this gets stuck at the end of the event loop of JavaScript, and there's some really good tutorials on the event loop. I may make one, but I can link to another video on the event loop. But anyway, this promise gets stuck at the end of the event loop, and then it continues running the program. So cats.data.then hasn't really happened yet, because the .then is what happens when the promise has resolved and it's the promise's turn to run, which has been placed at the end of the event loop. So we run goodbye world, and then finally the JavaScript program has nothing to do, so then it checks, okay, is there anything else to do? Is there anything else to do? And then the promise has resolved, so it adds the new task to resolve the promise, so that's when this .then gets run with the success callback function here. So we've resolved it, we've resolved the promise, and then the success callback gets run with whatever has been passed in to resolve. So the success callback runs, it says console.log in success callback, and then it logs out the res parameter. And the res parameter in this case is what was passed into resolve. So we get in success CB, the promise has succeeded. And we can see here in success CB, the promise has succeeded. So that in a nutshell is promises. And so let's make it look a little bit more like what a regular promise would look like. So the first thing, just to kind of demonstrate, I want to put a console.log at the top to say in cats data promise. And then a network request, like to some other website, usually takes, a little bit of time. So we're going to make a set timeout. And we're going to pretend that this network is really slow right now. So it takes 4 seconds. So I'm going to say set timeout for 1,000 milliseconds. And then we're going to move the resolve into the set timeout. And then also, rather than a string like this, we're going to say, and we're going to pass an object. So cat names with an array of cat names. Okay, and then now we can't just pass, or we can't just send this the res. We would have to get the res.catnames. But let's give it a try here, just like it is. Okay, so we get cat names array, and we get the cat names. I guess we could leave it like that for now. So this is a promise that takes 4 seconds to resolve. So sometimes a network or a website that you request information from, or your API, is bad. Something wrong happens and it can't get the data. So let's talk about that kind of situation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this entire project here, this little file here, folder, where I'm going to copy the promises into a success, and I'm going to paste it into the promises. That way we can start over again in an isolated series, folder. I'm going to rename it. I'm going to call it promises intro fail. Okay, so now we have another project. I'm going to grab this index.html and drop it into here. We're going to get the same thing because we just have this success. It's the same exact thing, but we need to make it fail now. So what I want to do is, the first thing is, in this promise here, we only have resolve. So there's a second parameter for a failure callback. So the standard is to call this reject. So we can call it reject. And then now, if something fails in the promise, we can reject. We can send the data into the reject, or what happens when the promise fails. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make I'm going to simulate a fail by making a variable. We're going to say let request success, and I'm going to say equals false. And so you can quickly toggle this from true to false to change a success or failed promise. So inside this set timeout, I'm going to say if request success, then we resolve. Otherwise, we fail. And so what do we pass into the reject? Well, whatever the problem was. So you could give it like a network, a HTTP response, or it's just some kind of error message like, hey, maybe the password was bad, or there's no cats by this name, or whatever. So you would pass whatever failure message you want to pass. And so I'm just going to say, oh no, so sorry. So that's going to be the failure message. And now if we were to run this, the promise would run. The request success is equal to false. So in the set timeout, it would wait 4 seconds, after calling goodbye world. It would wait 4 seconds, and then it would see that the request success is false, so it would reject. And so we have nothing to happen right now. So let's just run it and see what happens. So I'm in the promises intro fail, and promises intro fail is in the browser. So if we refresh this, we should get something interesting. Okay, so it says uncaught, and that means we haven't handled an error scenario for this promise. But it does give us, some details. But we do not like how it's uncaught. So we get, oh no, so sorry. But we want to make sure that we properly handle an error scenario. And so with this .then, this is what happens when the promise completes. And so we've told it what to do when the promise succeeds, which is to run this success callback. But we need a function for the failure scenario too. So let's go ahead and make a function for the failure. So I'm going to say function fail CB, and I'm going to pass it a response. And we're going to say inside of here, console.log, something bad happened. Here's the message from the promise, colon, and then I'm going to say console.error res. And so we have this callback here for a failure scenario, but we still haven't told the promise anything about this failure callback. So we do that again with then, because the .then is what happens when the promise is completed. And the completedness of the promise could either be a failure or a success. So again, we've told the promise what to do in the case of a success, but we need to say, here's what happens when the promise fails. And so we're going to pass in the fail CB as the second parameter. So now, if we hit save and refresh, we get something bad happened. Here's the message from the promise. Oh no, so sorry. So something bad happened. Here's the message from the promise is explicitly in this fail CB. So now we have a completely working promise. We have an asynchronous thing that happens inside the promise that takes some time. So we continue running the program, and then we have a success scenario. So when the promise is successful, we return an object with cat names, and then we run the success callback, which logs the cat names. And then if there's a problem with the network or any sort of problem with the resolution of the promise, we tell the program about the error by sending in an error message to reject. And then we also pass this message to the failure callback, which then handles the failure. So we have a completely working promise in this code. And also, you won't always see a success callback and a failure callback in their own specifically named functions. A lot of times you'll see something like this. So here is one way to do this. An alternative is to say cats data dot then, and then the function for the success callback. So we would say res and then console.log in success CB. So I'm going to paste that in here. So this is taking the place of this success callback here. It's just an unnamed function. And then maybe you would have a fail callback, or maybe you would have this function here also be unnamed. So I'm going to copy that here, paste it, and see, that kind of looks messy and gross. I really don't like that, but it is an alternative. So let's comment this out, and I'm just going to say ew, gross, to kind of signal that this is the one that's being called. So save, refresh, and we get ew, gross, something bad happened. And so this is just another format. It's kind of gross, but it works the same. And it's also, you don't have to, waste time naming a function. So whatever is better for you depends on your situation. But I kind of like naming things just to make it a little cleaner. So I'm going to save it like this, and maybe have it a comment. Alternative to the cats data.then line. Okay, so that is this full situation for success and failing promises. And this isn't anything really special, but you can also, to make it look more like what you would see in the wild, let's go ahead and copy this promises intro fail, and we're going to paste it into the promises folder. I'm going to rename this promises with function. And we're just going to wrap the promise in a function. So I'm going to say const fetch cats equals a function. And then we're going to grab this whole promise, and we're going to return a new promise. So I'm going to get rid of the cats data const. I'm just going to say return new promise. And then in here, I'll say console.log inside fetch cats. Okay, and then this gives us the opportunity to pass in variables like, hey, get, cats with the 4 legs or whatever, or 3 legs. So they're, pass in parameters to the fetch, which you can use to manipulate the promise or whatever. So now that we have this function returning a new promise, we can just do something like const cats from web equals fetch cats, and then instead of cats data dot then, we could do cats from web dot then success and fail. And then let's turn this request success to a true. Save. And then now we can see, this is very similar to the fetch API that you have probably seen before, hopefully, or maybe like Axios or something like that. And so we'll save, and then let's bring this index.html in here. And if we wait a few minutes or a few seconds, we get in success callback, cat names, and now we have our cats data. And so this is just to mimic like what the fetch API looks like. So hopefully that helps, and that is promises. So now let's go ahead and talk about async and await. So the first thing we'll do to set up async and await is I'm going to close this out, and I'm going to duplicate or copy paste this folder to set up a new project. So instead of calling it promises with function, I'm just going to call it async-await. And then we'll drag and drop this index.html into the page here. And we'll end up with the same thing. So this all works. And let's kind of play around with the script file. So the first thing that I want to do is get rid of the .then style of promises. So because we're not going to do a .then, and we're not going to have a failure or a success callback. So we're going to get rid of those and save. And so we're going to use async and await to wait for this promise to complete. And so in order to do that, we need to have an async keyword in front of a function, which will allow us to wait for the promise inside of that function. So instead of just calling fetch cats, which returns a promise, we need to do this inside of an asynchronous function. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new function, and I'm going to call it await fetch cats, and it's going to equal an async function, basically just a function with the async keyword in front of it. And then we're going to console.log just to kind of keep it bearings of where we're at. So I'm going to say top of await fetch cats function. Always do that. And then we are going to await the results of that promise. So I'm going to say const results equals await fetch cats. So what's going to happen is we're going to call this function, and this function here is going to pause until after this promise returns the results, whether it's a success or a failure. So we're going to say const results equals await fetch cats, and then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to console.log the results. And just to make it a little bit clearer, I'm going to say in await fetch cats. And we haven't called this function yet, but usually when you call a function, you want to return the value. So we're going to say return results. So now instead of calling fetch cats, we actually want to call await fetch cats. So I'm going to change this. I'm going to say await fetch cats, and we can leave this the same. Okay, and so we've stored whatever this returns into cats from web. So let's go ahead and print that out. So we'll do console.log cats from web is cats from web. And then just at the very end, we'll do a console.log goodbye world, just to signal that we're at the end of the program. And let's do one more thing here, and that's add a console.log after set timeout, just to see where this runs. So I'm going to say console.log after set timeout. Okay, so you'll notice this is in the promise. It's just after the set timeout. Okay, so we'll make sure we save that. Okay, so it's saved. Let's go back to our browser, make sure we're in the right file. So async await. Let's refresh, and here's all of what we get. And so let's go through this step by step and just see the order of execution. And I'm gonna I think I have a console log in every step, so I'm gonna try to just do like a 1 and a 2 all the way through. So the first one's obviously hello world here, and then we create this function fetch cats, but it doesn't do anything because we're just creating this function. And then here at await fetch cats, we're also just creating a function. Nothing's really happening. So the next thing that happens is we actually create a const cats from web, and we have this await fetch cats, which is a function. So we run this function and store the return value of this into cats from web. So in order to store something in here, we have to know what this function is returning. So we run this function. So the next step is to go into this await fetch cats function, and here we get another console log. So this would be number 2. And then the next step is we go down to the next line, and this says const results equals await fetch cats. And so an await can only work inside of a function with the async keyword in front of it. So that's just a tip. And we're going to run this fetch cats function. So even if we didn't have this await and async, it would still run this function before moving down here. But let's go ahead and just continue on. So we're going to run this fetch cats function. So here in this fetch cats, we have the third console log. So I'm going to write 3 dot, and then it'll say inside fetch cats. And then here we return a promise. So this promise, it just runs as normal because there's no asynchronous code yet here. So this would be step 4. And then we're going to set the request success to be true. And then here's the set timeout. So here's the first bit of asynchronous code. So we set a timer and we wait 4 seconds. After this 4 seconds is up, then we can put this block here of code to run in the queue. So it doesn't run in the queue, but it waits in line to be run in the queue. So when there's nothing left to do in JavaScript, then JavaScript will check the queue, and then it will see that this set timeout timer is completed. So then we can run this code. But first we have to actually run the timer. So 4 seconds go by, and then the code continues on, because we don't want to wait 4 entire seconds and have the whole entire program just block. So we set the timer, and it runs in the background, and then the rest of the program continues running. So after we set this timer, the next step, we don't actually do any of this stuff in here. Oh, you know what? And I need a console log in here too. So console.log, and I'm going to put it up here. In set timeout. Okay, there we go. So the next step after this, after we start this timer, is to go here and we say after set timeout. So I'm going to say 5 dot, and so after set timeout. And so it would continue running, everything in here. So like if you had other stuff after this set timeout, it would just keep running all of this. And so we're at the end of this promise, and we're at the end of this fetch cats function. So, but the timer isn't done yet, and the promise is not resolved. So we go back down here where we've called fetch cats, and this is not done yet because we have a promise that is still pending. So because this is not done, this is not going to run yet. So what we do is we move on to the next step. And so we're at a block here right now, or not really a block, but we're waiting. So we're waiting here, and we don't want to wait. We need the program to continue running. So the next step is, let's go back to where we were when we originally got into this function, which was when we called await fetch cats. So we called await fetch cats, it went into here, then it went into fetch cats, then we got the promise. And so we're waiting here, so we need to continue on. So the last step was number 5. So, and this whole function chain started here. So we're at the end of the road here until the promise finishes. So we need to come back to this await fetch cats and continue on. So the next step is actually right here. 6 cats from web. And so again, we're returning the value from await fetch cats, and await fetch cats is returning a promise. So this results here is a promise, and we're returning results from await fetch cats. So await fetch cats returns a promise to cats from web. So the next step is 6 cats from web, and this value here is a promise. So we're gonna, and the promise is not completed yet. So the next step is to hit goodbye world. So 7 period goodbye world, and let's see if we're just on track so far. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We're good so far. Oh, and I have another goodbye world because it's way down here and I forgot. So I'm gonna go ahead and get rid of that. Okay, so we're at goodbye world, and then we have nothing to do. So the program just sits idly, and there's nothing to do in the call stack, and then boom, all of a sudden, 4 seconds later, the timer finishes. So this timer is finished, so now we can run this, well, there's an instruction to run this block of code here in the queue whenever there's nothing left to do. So there's nothing left to do. We have the instruction to run this block of code, so we can do it now because there's nothing left to do. So now we get into this in set timeout. And so we were here at step 7. So the next one is 8 in set timeout. And then the request success variable is true. So we're going to resolve this. So we resolve this, and then that means the promise is complete. So once the promise is complete, then this await fetch cats here is finished. So we can continue on here. So now we finally have the results, and so this would be step 9. So once this promise here is finished, then we can continue on the execution here. So 9 results in await fetch cats, and then we get to log our results. And I think that is it. So let's save, refresh. 8 and 9. So results in await fetch cats, and then we get our data. And so the thing you'll notice is that we don't really have at least a good way to get the data out of this function. And if you scope and structure your app correctly, then it's not going to be a problem. But it's just something to keep in mind that you'll want to use and structure your app in such a way that you don't have to pull it out into like the global scope or anything. But again, structuring your app correctly, there should be no problem. And so let's look at this one more time without the async and await. So let's copy this, and I'm going to paste it into the promises folder, and I'm going to call it async await, no await. It probably doesn't make sense, but it's okay. So we're going to drag this index.html into here, hit enter, and then now, oh, it's going to run the same because it's the same exact code. But let's go into the no await folder, and we're going to get rid of the async and await. So I'm going to save, refresh, and now we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 9, 6, 7, 8. So it's a little bit out of whack, and that's because the await function is no longer waiting for the promise to finish. It just continues on as soon as the fetch cats function completes. So let's go through this one more time. I know it's a little bit tedious, but I think it'll help, and I recommend you try to do it on your own, but we're just going to go ahead and go through it. So step 1 is the hello world, and then we create the function, but we don't actually do anything with it yet. We create this function, but we don't do anything. So the next step is to await fetch cats. So we call this function and store the return value into cats from web. So we're inside await fetch cats. Step 2, top of await fetch cats function. Then we call fetch cats and store the return value into results. So let's go into fetch cats. So in here in fetch cats, step 3 is inside fetch cats. Then we go into the promise. There's no asynchronous stuff yet, so we run step 4 in cats data promise. And then here's our first bit of asynchronous code. This needs to wait. So it waits until the timer is finished. So the rest of the program continues on without the timer. So step 5 here is after set timeout. And so we're done with the fetch cats function now. So let's go back to where we called it. So we called it here. So we have the return value here, which is a promise. So we have a pending promise here, returned from fetch cats and stored into results. And this time, instead of waiting, we don't have the await. So we just continue on in this function because we have to finish this function. It's the next step in the call stack. So the next step is to call this step 9 here. But this isn't step 9 anymore. So this is more like step 6 because I don't know if it's better to keep it at 9. I think we'll just change it to 6. But so now the step 6 is to console log this results in await fetch cats with the value of results, which is still a pending promise. So we don't actually get the data. And then we return this unfinished data, this promise, into whatever called await fetch cats. So await fetch cats was called, and we're storing the return value into cats from web. And then down in the next step, which is 7, then we're console logging cats from web, which again is a pending promise. And then we call goodbye world, and then we're at the end of our call stack, so we have nothing left to do. And finally, the timer finishes. So we're at step 8 right now. The timer finishes, so that gets added to the queue. And then when there's nothing to do, JavaScript checks the queue and sees this function, this block here of code that needs to be run. So we were at step 8. The next step is to run the stuff that was inside of the set timeout. So 9 in the set timeout. And that is it. Basically, because we resolved this function, but we don't actually have a .then to do anything to it. So we never actually get our data in this situation. So I'm gonna go ahead and hit save and refresh and see if we got the order correct. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So that is how promises work, and that is how async and await works. So there's one more thing that I want to do just for the sake of completion with the promises tutorial, and that is handle the potential for rejection. So in our async await here, we have it and we just assume that everything succeeds. So what happens if it fails? Well, let's figure that out. So let's copy and paste the async await. I'm going to paste it into the promises folder again. I'm going to rename the copy async await -reject. Okay, and then we're going to open that up. I'm going to drag the index.html into here, hit enter, and then what we'll do, okay, we see that we do get the cat names when it succeeds, but what if it fails? So let's set this request success to false. We'll hit save, refresh, and then the promise will reject until we get an uncaught error, and then that's going to break the application. We want to properly handle any sort of error. So there's a variety of ways to do that, and we'll probably have to do a separate video just on error handling, but I will show you at least one way to deal with that. So the easiest way in this case is to just use a try catch. So let's first go in here to await fetch cats, which is where we run our attempt at getting a result back from the promise with this fetch cats function here. So we call it here. So this is the part that could throw an exception. So what I want to do is I want to make a try and catch block. So the catch will catch if there's an error, and it gives us a parameter that we can use like for the error. So this will end up being what is passed from the promise, but we'll see that in a moment. So anyway, we have try catch. And so what we're going to try to do here, because there's no guarantee that this is going to work, but we can try it. So let's try to run this await fetch cats. So we're going to try that. And I'm also going to say that this try, like at the top of it, we're going to have a console.log, and we're going to have a step 8.5, which is attempting something that might throw an exception. And then here we get potentially our results. And then console.log, step 9, success, results in await fetch cats are the results. So this is what happens if it works. And then instead of returning results down here, we will return them inside of the try block. Okay, and so if there's an error, then the error will happen here. And so it's not going to get past this. So if an error happens here, we're not going to make it to this code. Instead, it's going to throw us into the catch section of the code. And so we're going to either get the 9 success or the 9 fail. So console.log 9 fail results in await fetch cats. And I'm going to say console.error error. So we're going to pass in this error parameter that was given to us through the try catch, which was actually the result of the promise rejection. So that's what we have, and then we can either return the error, or you could also return a new error with the error passed in, and in this case we get an object with a .message property on it. So there's a couple different ways to deal with that, and again, this isn't an error handling video, so we're just going to have this be our code. I think that's everything that we need. So let's take a look. I think I might have gotten that 8.5 out of order. Yeah, because we hadn't hit the asynchronous code. So I'll say 2.5. But yeah, we have this error here. So fail, 9 fail results in await fetch cats. Oh no, so sorry. And then let's move this to 2.5. Okay. And so yeah, that's pretty much all for promises. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that console.log because it's not used anymore. And yeah, that's pretty much it. The only difference between this reject file or folder and then the async await one is that the promise fails. And so when the promise ends up rejecting, it either has an uncaught exception and the program will crash, but because we use this try catch, it attempts to run the promise, it gets an error, so it catches the error and then handles it according to how you want to handle an error. So you can redirect to the home page or whatever you want to do in this code here. So anyway, that is try catch with promises, and this is promises overall in JavaScript. Hopefully this was helpful. Thank you for watching the video. Please subscribe to our channel and click the bell to be notified when we release new tutorials. Also be sure to like the video and leave a comment to let us know what you think. Lastly, check out the link or links in the description. We usually create a blog post to go with the tutorial, and we might have a newsletter or course or something to check out as well. Have a good day, and I'll see you next time.